It is very scary. It is. I think the main reason to be hopeful about this is the fact that, in fact, the West does not have capacity to wage war against Russia. In the end, they are a paper tiger, and that each one of these escalations is going to fizzle. They have, so they'll keep on going up the escalation ladder until they get to the nuclear. And I just hope at that point they realize that they can't do anything.
Right.
I believe, maybe I shouldn't be so hopeful, but I believe at that point they'll say, okay, enough is enough. Let's just, we've got to call this off. We just can't go down that route. They understand that if they fire nuclear missiles at Russia, that's the end of Western civilization. And I think that they will stop at that point. These people are really stupid. They're hysterical. They are um, they're victims of their own narrative and so on and so forth. But I don't think they're like the Israeli leadership I, that is truly genocidal and apocalyptic in its thinking. I and I don't think the Israelis would hesitate to use a nuclear weapon if they began to lose, but I think that the West will stop at that point. I think that we'll see a difference, and so I think they were going to have a very scary ride right up to the true edge of the abyss, and they're going to totter there, and then I think the West will step back at that point. But it's going to be a
Well,
very, very scary ride, and things could go wrong.
well, there's a lot of I thinks in there that
I know.
that
Yeah,
are
well,
kind of
that's
like.
right. Yeah. Well, what can I say?
I know, but I'm not knocking you. But it's just scary to think that we're going to go right up to the nuclear weapon, the nuclear option, and then we think that cooler heads will prevail.
Right.
I
Or
really hope
these.
so.
Right.
I think so. But let's say even if that does happen, we make it all the way up. We keep on. We send whatever we can. How much further can we escalate? I feel like we've kind of
Right.
reached the peak of our escalation. Do we start
Right. They're
sending
not
troops?
just. Yeah. Well, you can talk about Tomahawk missiles. Again, as Zelensky's requested them, and it seems like everything Zelensky requests eventually gets. But again, it won't make a difference, and it's something that we just can't give them enough to make a difference. Look, I think in the last year, the Russians fired 4,000 missiles into Ukraine. Ukraine is it's a large country, but much smaller than Russia.
I think 6,000 actually is what I
Yeah,
heard.
well, I think over the course of the conflict, it's 6,000,
Oh, okay.
and maybe just 4,000 in a year. But in any case, we're talking about lots of missiles. And then, um, and now, according to some pretty good sources, I think it was Daniel Davis has connections to the Pentagon. Like the at the very most, the West has like 150 Storm Shadows and ATACMS to spare. So we're talking about 150 against 4,000, right? And again, the other side has much better air defense and a much vaster territory. What's it going to do? And then the same thing with the Tomahawks. There's limited numbers, and they are a real crucial strategic missile for U.S. forces. They just can't spare that many. So even if they get up to that's very advanced weapon that can strike deep into Russia, it will not do anything. They'll go up the escalation line. Nothing will make a difference. And then I think maybe the final thing is boots on the ground. And let's say they try that. Apparently the UK has about 20,000 combat soldiers, very poorly armed. They don't have real combat experience. They've been trained for the wrong kind of war. What are they going to do? They're not going to last. If Russia is taking out, according to the Russian MOD, they're taking out 2,000 soldiers a day on the average on the front. Basically, that's 10 days. Maybe these British soldiers will go even faster because they just have no idea what they're doing. And then the
Right.
French only have some few more, but not much more than the British. They cannot put together a force that would make a bit of difference. And you say, well, and the thing is, again, this is part of their weakness. They don't really have the popular support. And if they say, okay, we need to start conscripting people, I think that would be the end. I don't think that their populations are going to go, no, I'm not going to go fight the Russians. And I think it stops right there. Then you have the question, are we going to use nuclear weapons? And I just don't think they're going to do it.
Okay, I
I
hope
think they're
so.
going to, at that point, they'll go into the fetal position and start sucking their thumbs.
I really hope so. But my fear is if, like, what scares me is when you said that you think that there's a good chance that Russia will strike somewhere within NATO. I mean, you said that this next one they'll probably hit a target again within Ukraine. But if it continues and we continue, which it seems like we are, doesn't seem like we don't care about how many Ukrainians die and what infrastructure gets blown up in Ukraine. Blow them all to hell. Apparently, is our position. You know.
Yeah.
But once they do, if they do strike somewhere within NATO, I think that will change the game, and they could be able to capitalize on that in terms of earn popular support, saying like, look, NATO is now under attack by Russia. We have to invoke Article 5. We have to defend ourselves against this Russian aggression. Yeah. You know, now this war has taken on that Russia is directly attacking us. That's what they will say. And
they'll say, yeah.
That's
right.
That's where it gets a little scary for me.
Yeah, it does get scary. I'm not saying that there's, but I still think they're not going to be able to actually conscript large numbers of Europeans and send them off to the front. I think that, a lot of people will get online and say, damn those Russians or whatever, but then when they get the draft notice or their threat of a draft notice, they just say, I'm not doing this.
Okay, well, everything you said to me sounds plausible, so let's just assume that happens, that we keep on going up the escalation ladder, and from what you said, it sounds like there's only a few more steps on this ladder that we could take before we get to the top rung of the nuclear option. We stop at the nuclear option. Everybody, the NATO politicians adopt a fetal position and suck their thumbs, as you say. Then what happens? What happens to NATO? What happens to the West?
Yeah.
Does the whole thing crumble? Do we have a collapse? Do we get new governments in place? How does this end?
No, obviously sent huge political shockwaves through Europe and to a lesser extent through the U.S. It's easier because the U.S. has a whole ocean between ourselves and the problem. It's easier for the U.S. to walk away from it, but it will be impossible for European politicians to walk away from it. It's going to cause huge shockwaves throughout Europe, and it may bring about the fall of European governance, and maybe we'll get the true dissident parties that have been growing in popularity and who want to make peace with Russia. Maybe they will take power. That's a rosy scenario, and I think there's a real possibility that will happen. The other possibility is that all these governments that have been showing increasing authoritarian tendencies in the West will just go down that road and say, oh, we now have to institute martial law, because now we have these parties within our country that are collaborating with the Russians, and that's how they talk about them already, and there already have been efforts to ban them, and that's maybe the road that they'll go down. We'll see. It's going to be very interesting.
Well, what about for America? I mean, do you think that this will be the end of the American empire?
It's not going to be the end of the American empire, but of course it will be a blow. But it'll be easier for the Americans to extricate themselves from it. We do have a history of walking away from conflicts. Of course, the best examples are Vietnam and Afghanistan, and they both ended disastrously for us. And it did cause some damage to the governments that were in charge at the time. But in the end, America went on. It wasn't anywhere close to a mortal blow. Now, this, of course, will be more serious. It certainly will. Because it's so clear that we went all the way up this escalation ladder. We threw everything at the Russians, and it followed. I think you could say, like in the case of Afghanistan or Vietnam, these were never existential struggles for us, and they were very much. Well, wars of choice. They certainly can say that about Ukraine too, though. And it was, it could just be put off as a, mistake. In any case, they could say that, well, we could have won this war, but we just decided it wasn't worth the cost. And I think that's in fact true. If the Americans had decided to just go all in in Vietnam, conscript another 1 million or 2 million soldiers or whatever, but it just wasn't worth the cost and would lead to all kinds of domestic unrest. So they just said, okay, we got to pull out of it. It's just that the North Vietnamese are making this too costly for us, just like the Taliban in Afghanistan. Say, well, we could have defeated them. I think that's true, but we just couldn't. Now, I don't think that argument can be made in Ukraine. It's just like we've done everything. You see, we're giving the best of our best, and it's still none of it's working. And that's going to be hard to explain. They're very creative when it comes to explaining things away and saying that, in fact, this was a tremendous success and they weakened Russia and not what. But it will definitely damage the reputation of the U.S. worldwide. I think more than any of these other wars will. And it will raise a lot of eyebrows and within the U.S. Again, there are people who I'm sure the majority is hard to believe will still, think that the U.S. is number one, that Russia was pathetic, that we taught them a lesson there, whatever. It'll just be absurd. But that's what's going to be said on CNN and Fox News, and that's what most people are going to believe. But the world won't believe it. And there will be a growing number of people within the U.S. that, won't believe it and realize that, we are no longer top dog.
Well, if these dissident parties in Europe, they take over, they maintain control, and then they want to restore relations with Russia, and then they rightly begin to point the finger of this whole conflict at NATO and the United States, couldn't that lead to the disintegration of NATO, the EU,
it could,
and ultimately the disintegration of the American empire? Because really, the American empire.
That's true. Right. Well,
So
I think
that's
you're right.
Hope.
So, yeah, I think so. But it also shows. I think the Americans are going to understand that, and all their establishment friends within Europe are going to understand it. So they're going to fight this tooth and nail. It's going to be an ugly battle. So let's just hope that the good guys win. That's all I can say.